In just 9 minutes, Judge Clarence Thomas accused Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett of treason, threatening to imprison her right there in front of a packed courtroom. Cameras rolled, and over 22 million Americans watched live. But no one was prepared for what she did next. Jasmine opened her briefcase and pulled out a crumpled, time-worn letter. A letter written by a grieving black mother who had buried her only son after a military operation the government had tried to erase. The courtroom fell deathly still. Jurors wept. Reporters froze. Even the judge's hands began to shake. What truth could be so devastating, so undeniable, that it shattered a Supreme Court justice's case and sparked a national reckoning? This wasn't just a trial anymore. It was a moment that America couldn't ignore. For the first time, the silence was broken. But to understand the power of that letter, you have to go back to the moment Jasmine Crockett first walked into that courtroom. Alone. It began on a cold Tuesday morning in Washington, D.C., a morning that made even seasoned politicians check the weather twice. The clouds outside were low and bruised, hanging over the Capitol like a warning. Inside the federal courthouse, the halls of justice didn't feel just. They felt restless. Reporters lined the marble corridors, pacing like caged animals, clutching recorders and coffee cups as if both would steady their nerves. Something big was about to happen. They could feel it in their bones. Whispers slithered through the air. Sealed indictments, emergency orders, something about national security, but no one had confirmed anything. Courtroom 3B was packed by 8:30 a.m. Senators filled the back benches, their aides scribbling furiously in notepads. Former officials, military brass, even a few recognizable TV anchors were seated in the gallery, eyes sharp, waiting. It was a rare thing when the highest levels of the judiciary collided with Congress in public view. Even rarer when Justice Clarence Thomas, known for his silence on the bench, was the one presiding. Rumors had exploded the night before that a sitting member of Congress would be called to answer accusations related to a top-secret military operation. But even then, no one expected her. The courtroom doors creaked open just before 9 a.m. Heads turned, conversations died mid-sentence, and then she walked in. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, alone. No legal team, no bodyguards, no entourage, whispering advice, just her. Her silhouette was sharp, her stride deliberate. She wore a tailored navy blue suit, unassuming, yet it couldn't hide the storm in her eyes. In one hand, she carried a worn brown leather briefcase, the kind no one carries unless it means something. Her hair was pinned tightly, not for style but for control. The sound of her heels clicking on the stone floor echoed like a countdown. Click, click, click. Each step slicing through the tension like a scalpel, and she didn't look at a single person in that courtroom. Not the senators, not the press, not even the judge. She looked forward, only forward. Whispers erupted behind her as she made her way to the defendant's table. Is that really her? Why is she alone? She's not even trying to defend herself. The speculation flew like darts. Some people snickered, expecting a dramatic breakdown. Others waited with barely concealed glee, hoping this would be the end of her rising political star. Jasmine placed her briefcase gently on the table, opened it just slightly, then folded her hands. Calm, composed, completely unshaken. And that's when the door at the front of the courtroom opened. Justice Clarence Thomas entered, his presence commanding the room. There was no smile, no warmth, just a man who knew this moment would be remembered, not just as a ruling, but as a legacy. His black robe billowed slightly as he stepped up to the bench. His jaw was tight, his gaze razor-sharp. Without waiting for the usual formalities, he spoke. The room hadn't fully settled when his voice rang out, deep and resonant. Congresswoman Jasmine Crockett, he began, his tone icy. This court is in possession of classified evidence indicating that you willfully withheld military intelligence related to Operation Hollow River. His words sliced through the air with precision. You are hereby accused of treason against the United States of America. You will answer under oath. The room gasped. An audible gasp. A woman in the gallery dropped her pen. A man in the press section muttered, "What the hell?" loud enough for everyone to hear. Then, laughter. Not joy, but disbelief. The kind of laughter that escaped then was the kind you hear when people think they've just witnessed the beginning of a political execution. Some smirked. Others shook their heads in disgust. One of the aides in the back actually fist-pumped under the table. To them, it looked like Jasmine Crockett's career was about to be burned alive, broadcasted for millions to see. But the woman at the center of this storm didn't flinch. Jasmine stood slowly, deliberately. Her chair slid back with a low scrape that echoed through the courtroom. She didn't raise her voice, didn't shout her innocence or call for a lawyer. Instead, she placed her hands flat on the table, looked up at the most feared judge in America, and asked a single chilling question. "Are you sure you want this?" The room froze. Not paused, froze. That one sentence hit harder than any denial, any plea, any objection could have. It wasn't defiance, it wasn't desperation. It was certainty. The kind that rattles your bones because you know it's not for show. And in that moment, Justice Thomas faltered. Just for a second, his lips parted slightly, his eyes narrowing, not in anger but in calculation. Somewhere deep down he understood that Jasmine Crockett wasn't just walking into a trial. She was walking into war, and she had brought something with her that the courtroom wasn't ready for. The accused was about to become the accuser. By the time this was over, no one, not the judge, not the jury, not the country, would be able to unhear what she came to say. The silence in the courtroom grew so thick it felt like the air itself had stopped breathing as Jasmine Crockett reached into her briefcase. Everyone expected a legal maneuver, some technical counterattack or a well-prepared defense, but that's not what she pulled out. No exhibit. No affidavit. Just a letter. A single, weathered letter, folded into thirds. Its edges were curled, as though it had been opened and closed more times than anyone could count. The corners were dog-eared, one side marked with a faded fingerprint. Maybe ink, maybe dirt, maybe something else. There was a coffee stain on the bottom edge, and a tear running diagonally across the fold that had been taped over and over again. This was no ordinary letter. It had been clutched tightly, possibly cried over. Jasmine didn't raise her voice. She didn't build up to it. She simply held the paper in both hands, and with a tone that was steady, low, yet unshakable, she said, "This is not evidence. This is a truth we were never meant to see." And just like that, the courtroom transformed. It was no longer a stage for political spectacle. It became a quiet, reverent space. A place where ghosts could finally speak. Jasmine opened the letter, as if it were sacred scripture, unfolding each crease and line with careful reverence. Then she began to read aloud. And the room? The room fell into stunned silence. "My name is Mara Wilkins. I am the mother of Private First Class Darius Wilkins. He was my only child. He died 2 years ago in an operation the Army told me nothing about." Her voice was even, but there was something else there, a second rhythm beneath the words, as though she wasn't just reading it, she was carrying it. "They came to my door with a flag and 3 uniformed men. They called him a hero. They said he served with honor, but they never told me how he died. They never told me why." A quiet shiver ran through the crowd. A journalist stopped typing mid-sentence. One senator leaned forward, suddenly still. Jasmine read on, the words tightening like a vice around the room. "I asked questions. They said it was classified. I begged. They said it was for national security. But when I closed his bedroom door that night, I knew something was wrong. I knew they were hiding something." A murmur of discomfort rippled through the gallery. Yet Jasmine's voice remained steady, as though the letter had infused her with a new kind of strength. "For months, I couldn't sleep. I started dreaming about him. I'd hear his footsteps on the stairs. I'd smell his shampoo in the hallway. Sometimes I'd think I heard him laugh just for a second and then remember he wasn't coming back." That line hit like a brick, through glass. You could hear sniffles, subtle at first, but they spread. even among those who had come in with arms crossed, waiting to see her career fall apart. They weren't prepared for this, because this wasn't about Jasmine anymore. This was about a mother's grief, unanswered and unhealed. I'm not writing this because I want someone punished. I'm writing because I want someone, anyone, to tell the truth. I want someone to say my son mattered, that his life wasn't just a statistic buried in redacted reports. Jasmine paused long enough to let the silence flood in like a wave. When she looked up from the final line, the courtroom was no longer the same. The smug looks were gone. The scoffing smiles, gone. All of it disappeared. The jurors sat frozen, some with their mouths slightly open, others with glazed eyes, fighting back something they couldn't name. One of them, a retired Navy vet, pressed his thumb into the corner of his eye and stared hard at the floor. A court reporter's fingers hovered above the keyboard, paralyzed. Even the gallery, packed with pundits and cynics, had gone completely still. What had started as a trial was now a funeral, with witnesses. No one dared break the silence, not even the judge. Somehow, without raising her voice, without throwing accusations or citing legal codes, Jasmine had done the impossible. She had made the entire room feel something, not for her but for a mother they had never met and a young man they would never know. Jasmine gently folded the letter back up, as if tucking someone in. She placed it on the table, her hands composed, and still. And in that stillness, the audience watching from court benches, living rooms, and cell phones across the country began to realize they weren't witnessing a defense. They were witnessing a reckoning. The room was still reeling from the letter, but Jasmine Crockett wasn't done. Not even close. With a soft click of the latch, she opened her briefcase again. This time, she didn't pull out something delicate. What she lifted out was cold, printed and official. Government documents, declassified, labeled top secret, Hollow River. The seal had been crossed out, but the weight of it still lingered. She placed the stack neatly on the table in front of her, as though she had rehearsed the motion 1,000 times in silence. The judge's clerks and cameras leaned forward. They had expected theater. They were about to get fire. I'm entering these into the public record, Jasmine said, as calm as a surgeon. These are not rumors. These are not opinions. These are federal records unsealed 7 days ago. A few people in the crowd snorted, scoffing under their breath. Another grandstand moment, one whispered. She thinks she's in a movie, muttered another. But Jasmine ignored them. She pulled the first page forward and held it up. Operation Hollow River. The header gleamed in bold black font. Below it, detailed timestamps, locations, names, and mission protocols. And beneath those, thick blocks of text that had once been redacted, now fully revealed. She flipped to a second page. This report, she said, was filed 48 hours after Darius Wilkins was declared dead. Her finger traced a single line, midway down the document. She read it aloud. Subject showing signs of life during extraction. Breathing shallow. Field medic notified. No follow-up recorded. A beat passed, then another. The meaning settled like a storm cloud. Darius Wilkins had been alive. The laughter vanished. This wasn't bureaucratic oversight. This wasn't a tragic battlefield miscommunication. This was a decision. A deliberate clinical omission that erased a life with the click of a key and a black marker. A juror let out a small, involuntary gasp. The court clerk stared at the paper in front of her, as if it had turned into something radioactive. One of the reporters in the front row actually mouthed the word, Jesus. Jasmine laid out another page. This one had a logistics signature. From Strat Defense, the private military contractor overseeing part of the operation. The logo was faint but visible beneath it, a breakdown of medical gear allocations, including a missing defibrillator and an unlogged field kit. Into her briefcase, Jasmine didn't reach slowly this time. She moved with a new kind of weight. With a swift motion, she held up a printed photo, blurry and in grayscale, but unmistakable enough to recognize the two men seated at a round table. Plates in front of them, wine glasses mid-toast, Justice Clarence Thomas and Leonard Kenner, the CEO of the very contractor tied to Darius Wilkins's death, sharing a dinner together 8 months ago in Georgetown. For a heartbeat, it felt like the entire room held its breath. A pin could have dropped. The air seemed to drain out, leaving an eerie stillness in its wake. Someone in the back row gasped audibly, unable to suppress the shock. Others just blinked, their minds scrambling to process what they'd just seen, and still Jasmine said nothing. She didn't need to. The photo said it all. Clarence Thomas shifted in his seat, his face, usually a cold, impenetrable mask, cracked, just enough for those paying close attention to see. There was no laughter now, not even from the cynics who had expected a show. This wasn't about partisanship, it wasn't about theater. Now, it was about truth, and the uncomfortable realization that the system meant to protect them had possibly buried more than just files. It may have buried people. The door at the back of the courtroom creaked open again, this time without announcement, without ceremony. Heads turned. Cameras didn't flash, but every eye in the room locked on the figure making her way slowly down the aisle. Eloise Wilkins. She was small, barely over 5 feet, her gray hair tightly curled, a cane clicking softly against the floor. But despite her frailty, something in her presence made the air thicken. She wasn't trembling. She wasn't intimidated. There was steel in her spine, strength that no grief had managed to bend. Jasmine glanced up, and for the first time that morning, her composure faltered. She stepped aside, wordlessly, making room near the witness box. Eloise didn't ask for permission. She adjusted the microphone slowly, cleared her throat, and looked directly at the judge with eyes that had buried too much. "I buried my daughter," she began, her voice quiet but unwavering. "And then I buried my grandson." "No," one spoke. The silence that followed wasn't just one of respect, it was guilt, thick and palpable. "And the only thing I've ever wanted since," she continued, her voice steady, "is to know what happened. Not what they put in a letter. Not what they said in the newspaper. What really happened." She reached into her purse and pulled out a worn photo, the edges curled from years of handling. Holding it up, she revealed her grandson, Darius, smiling in his uniform, standing beside a rusty old car with a bumper sticker that read, "Proud Army Mom." Her hand trembled as she held it. "He loved that car," she said, voice breaking with the weight of the memory. "Said he was going to fix it up when he came home." She paused, swallowed hard. "But he never came home. And they never told us why." Her voice cracked, not in weakness, but under the weight of 2 funerals and 0 answers. The room went quiet in a way that transcended respect. It was guilt. Next, to speak was a woman with short auburn hair and tired eyes. She wore a plain navy blazer, a small folder clutched in her lap. Her name was Susan Hale, a former Army nurse with credentials that were unquestionable, a record impeccable. But her face told another story, one of sleepless nights and the burden of memory. "I was on duty the night Private First Class Darius Wilkins was brought in," she began, barely above a whisper. "They told us it was classified, that we weren't to ask questions, that everything was under control." She paused, gathering herself before continuing, her voice cracking slightly. "But I saw him." She pressed her palms together, fingers interlaced, like she was praying for strength. He was still breathing. The courtroom stirred. "I remember," Susan continued, her voice barely holding. "He looked right at me, eyes welling with something that shouldn't have been there. And then, he was gone." He kept saying it over and over. "Tell my mama I'm okay." Like if he said it enough times, someone would make it true. Her lips trembled, but no one answered. And in the end, he died alone. A journalist lowered her camera, her hand instinctively covering her mouth. A juror gripped the armrest so tightly that their knuckles turned white. This wasn't just testimony, it was a confession. Susan Hale, once a woman who had waited years to speak her truth, now stood vulnerable, her words carrying the weight of all the time she had held them in, and then came the final blow. Jasmine nodded to a technician at the side of the courtroom. The lights dimmed just slightly and a speaker crackled to life. Static buzzed, then a voice, cold, calculated, and unmistakable. Clarence Thomas, if the mother pushes too hard, leaks something about a protocol violation, will shut the story down before it spreads. It was just one sentence, but it detonated in the courtroom like a bomb. A sharp inhale rippled through the gallery. Someone dropped their pen. The stenographer flinched. This wasn't a rumor. It wasn't a misquote. It was a direct recording of the judge himself, strategizing to bury the story of a mother's grief. Clarence Thomas, usually unreadable, shifted slightly in his chair. His jaw clenched, his gaze lowered, not in reflection, but in quiet realization. The game was up. There would be no rebuttal, no clarifications to soften the blow. What had started as a courtroom inquiry was now an exposed wound, and the nation was watching it bleed. No one knew what Jasmine Crockett would do next after the testimony, the documents, the recording. Everyone expected a fiery closing argument, a powerful final strike to drive it all home. But Jasmine didn't speak. She didn't approach the bench or point fingers. She simply turned, walked to the side of the room, and picked up an object that had been sitting quietly against the wall. It was a wooden chair, not a courtroom chair, not a government-issued one, but a plain, battered kitchen chair, the kind you'd find in any small, humble dining room across America. She carried it slowly to the front of the courtroom, placed it beside the witness stand, and rested one hand gently on its back. This, she said softly, belonged to Darius. Her voice was low, not broken, not theatrical, just honest. His grandmother gave it to me the day she buried her daughter. She said, "This is where he sat every night for dinner. This is where he told us he was going to enlist. This is the last place he laughed before he left." Jasmine's hand traced the curve of the backrest. "It's just wood, just a chair, but it's been empty for 2 years now. And it's a reminder of what silence costs." She didn't say another word. She didn't need to. The chair spoke for itself. Every person in the room saw it differently. Some saw loss. Others saw guilt. A few, perhaps the ones with medals, of their own, saw themselves. But one thing was undeniable. This wasn't a courtroom exhibit. This was a wound laid bare, in its simplest, most devastating form. No charts, no statements, just a seat left behind by someone who never got the truth. Then, in the stillness that followed, came a sound no one expected. Tiny footsteps from the gallery. A small boy, Caleb, no more than 9 years old, slowly walked forward. He wore a blazer too big for him, clutching something small in both hands. People watched as he passed rows of adults, unafraid. His eyes locked on Jasmine. She knelt to meet him, and he hesitated before uncurling his fingers. In his palms lay a scratched, tarnished military medal. Its ribbon was frayed at the edges. The metal had been worn smooth from being handled too, often by someone too young. His voice barely louder than a whisper, he said, "My big brother's name was James. He died 2 years ago. Nobody ever told us why." He looked down at the medal, then back up at Jasmine. "But you told the truth." Jasmine, who had withstood accusations, lies, and corruption without flinching, finally broke. Tears streamed down her face as she took the medal with both hands as if it were made of glass. She didn't wipe her eyes. She didn't apologize. She cried in front of the judge, the cameras, the press, because in that moment, it wasn't about politics. It wasn't about strategy. It was about a little boy, a lost brother, and a truth finally spoken aloud. The courtroom, once a fortress of power and control, sat in reverent silence, not because of what Jasmine had said, but because of what she had made them feel, and because of what that empty chair and that tiny medal left behind in all of them. By the time Jasmine stepped out of the courthouse, the story was no longer just hers. The steps outside were packed, shoulder to shoulder, with people, thousands of them. Some had come from across the city, others had driven in from neighboring states. There were mothers holding framed photos of sons and daughters in uniform. Elderly veterans stood with medals pinned to their jackets, their expressions unreadable. Children perched on shoulders, holding handmade signs that read, "Tell the truth. His life mattered." And we're still waiting. There were no chants, no chaos, just silence. A deep, deliberate silence that pulsed with meaning. People didn't come to protest. They came to witness. Jasmine didn't wave. She didn't speak. She simply walked down the steps, holding the folded letter and the small medal that had been placed in her hands by a child. A few people wept openly. One man removed his cap and placed it over his heart. And as she moved through the crowd, no one reached out to touch her. Instead, they made space. They parted for her, not like a politician, but like someone walking a sacred path. Because by now they all understood. This wasn't about scandal. It was about memory. And memory, once awakened, doesn't go back to sleep. Hours later, as the news cycle spun wildly trying to keep up, Justice Clarence Thomas quietly stepped down. There was no press conference, no public statement, no exit speech from the bench. Just a notice from the clerk's office, filed under administrative updates, and the distant sound of a heavy wooden door closing behind him. The resignation sent shockwaves through every major news outlet, social feed, and government building across the country. Commentators scrambled for explanations, allies fell silent, and opponents were unsure whether to celebrate or mourn. But, for those who had witnessed the events inside Courtroom 3B, the meaning was clear. This wasn't just a resignation. It was a surrender. Not to politics, but to truth. The kind of truth that doesn't shout or fight. It simply waits. And when it is finally heard, it changes everything. 3 days later, in a quiet corner of Arlington National Cemetery, something remarkable appeared. There was no ceremony, no military flyover, no podium or camera crews, just a simple black granite wall, long and impossibly still. The names etched into it didn't come with ranks or titles. They weren't alphabetized, nor were they announced. But for those who looked closely, they could see what made this wall different. These were the names once buried in redacted files, erased, hidden, forgotten. Someone had placed flowers along the base. Others left notes, some taped in plastic sleeves, others weighted down with stones. One card read, "You were never invisible to us." Another said, "Your name lives now." A third simply said, "I'm sorry it took this long." Jasmine visited the wall just after sunrise. She didn't stay long. She ran her fingers over Darius Wilkins' name, then turned away, not because she had nothing left to say, but because his name had already said enough. And for the first time in years, the silence felt clean, not empty but honest. The storm had passed. Not just the media frenzy or the political fallout, but the emotional flood that had shaken the courtroom and reached the conscience of a nation. Days later, Jasmine Crockett stood barefoot on her porch, the morning sun warming, the wood beneath her feet. Her niece Avery sat beside her on the top step, swinging her legs in silence. She was only 6 but had seen the news, heard the whispers, and witnessed the sadness on her aunt's face. Then suddenly, Avery looked up, clutching a plastic bowl in her lap. "Auntie Jasmine, can we bake cookies?" she asked. Jasmine raised an eyebrow, smiling faintly. "Cookies for the soldiers in heaven," Avery explained. "You said some of them didn't have anyone, so maybe we could send them cookies, just so they know we remember." Jasmine blinked. Her throat tightened. She crouched beside her niece, wrapped an arm around her small shoulders and whispered, "Yes, baby. Every single one." That evening, as the sun dipped low and the kitchen filled with the warm scent of sugar and flour, Jasmine stepped outside to find a letter taped to her front door. It was handwritten in careful, slightly shaky cursive, no envelope, no fanfare, just a name scrawled in the corner, Eloise Wilkins. Jasmine peeled the letter from the wood, gently unfolded it with reverence, and read, "You brought my grandson home, not with a casket but with truth. That's more than the government ever gave me. Thank you, Eloise." There were no other words. None were needed. Jasmine pressed the note to her chest and sat on the porch steps, eyes closed. The breeze moved through the trees like a sigh. Somewhere inside the house, Avery called out that the cookies were burning. Jasmine laughed through her tears and wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater. It didn't fix everything, but it meant something. And that was enough for now. People think justice always wears a robe, that it lives in high places behind marble walls with Latin inscriptions, that it's written in verdicts measured in years and delivered by gavels. But sometimes justice wears grief. Sometimes it walks in with a cane and a folded photo. Sometimes it's a tired nurse whispering a name no one wants to remember. And sometimes it's just a wooden kitchen chair, empty, scarred, and silent, waiting for someone brave enough to say, "He was here, he mattered, and you will not forget him." Justice isn't always about punishment. Sometimes it's about truth, and the courage to say it out loud. The most powerful truths are often buried, not because they are weak, but because they are inconvenient. This story reminds us that silence, when chosen by those in power, is a weapon. But when broken by someone brave enough to speak, it becomes a force of healing. Jasmine Crockett didn't fight with anger. She fought with compassion, memory, and a voice steady enough to carry the weight of the forgotten. In doing so, she reminded us of something vital. Justice doesn't begin in courtrooms. It begins in our willingness to care, to ask hard questions, to listen to voices that have been ignored, and to honor the lives of others, not with headlines, but with humanity. If we choose truth, even when it's uncomfortable, if we choose empathy, even when it costs us something, then we don't just become better citizens. We become better people. This story is a work of fiction created for dramatic and educational purposes. While it draws inspiration from real themes and public figures, all characters, including Jasmine Crockett and Clarence Thomas, as depicted here, are entirely fictionalized. They do not represent real-life individuals, their actions, beliefs, or reputations in any way. Any resemblance to real events or persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. If this story moved you, inspired you, or made you reflect, please subscribe to Morgan's Stories. Your support helps us continue bringing powerful narratives that give a voice to the forgotten, shine a light on truth, and remind us all of the humanity we share. Subscribe, like, and share, because some stories deserve to be heard.